So let me just walk you through this code.
I think it's a T-shirt.
Yeah, half a vector is no vector at all. I know, it could be like a math teacher or a T-shirt. Let me say two things before we go into this code. One, I just said a minute ago that the axes are between -1 and 1. That's approximate. The thing that I really can't stand about joysticks, this has always been true. Since the age of joysticks began, joysticks have been considered a noisy and inaccurate input device. They're noisy in the sense that they are analog, so they produce a tremendous number of inputs. Moving the joystick produces many more inputs than there are frames in your game. If I move the joystick to the left, in a second I may get 100 or 200 events, depending on the drivers on my computer, how often it's pulling the joystick, etc., etc. And so for us, that creates sort of a conundrum because we are going to be doing calculations based on these events. So if we're doing 200 calculations per second because we got a really noisy joystick that's producing lots and lots of events, then we got a problem. So in previous shows, I talked about a concept called what did I call it? Well, in this case, I'm going to call it throttling. That's not the term I used previously, but in a sense, what I'm doing is I'm saying, have I just processed an event for this input in this last? So let's say it's frame 10. Did I process an event in frame 10? No. Okay, then I can process it. Oh, I did? Then don't do any more processing until the next frame. So if I get 10 events in frame 10, I process the first one, I ignore the rest. Frame 11 comes along, and then it's time to get another event, and I get another event, I say, okay, I can process that one, and I'll ignore the next 10 that I get until I go to the next frame. So with joysticks, that works pretty well, but you can get yourself into a little bit of trouble. But before I go on to what the trouble is and how to solve it, let me talk about the noisiness. So in addition to another way to deal with noisiness is to set a sensitivity threshold. So the normal position for an axis when you're not touching your joystick should be 0, 0. The x-axis should be 0, the y-axis should be 0. But in reality, if you've ever had a joystick controller, you know that they don't always like align perfectly, so it's like a little bit off to the left, it's stuck a little bit up, or if you pick up your joystick, it gets a little bit of wiggling there, and so you get a little bit of movement just from picking it up. Or another really super frustrating thing for new users when they're trying to understand the axis event with a controller is they'll move the left joystick, but they'll get inputs from the right joystick. And the reason they do this is because the joysticks are super sensitive. So just a tiny bit of movement in the controller itself or near to a joystick will cause that joystick to fire off events. So if you'll see here in my code, I've got a variable called sensitivity. Now I am not using it, but I left the code in here. And the way I use sensitivity is I look at the input value for a particular axis, and I say if that value's absolute value is less than the sensitivity. So if I get an axis event of 0.1 for one of the axes, and its 0.1 is less than 0.15, I completely ignore it. I just say, that's a non-event. That didn't happen. That's a little jiggling or whatever. And this is also not a perfect solution. There are issues with this. And the issue is if you ignore all events around 0, you will never see 0. And 0 is an important event. It means that the joystick has been centered, and some action that you may have been taking, you can now stop doing. So you need to catch 0 events too. So for this example, I didn't use sensitivity. Instead, what I did, I'll finally walk through it now, is the first thing we do is I create a listener, and this is a function listener. It's not a table listener, so there's no self, there's no object that it is attached to. It's just taking an event. And I pull out the axis event. So it gets an event, and there's a field on it called axis. Now, axis is a table that contains a whole bunch of data, and I encourage people to print out or use the dump event. So go into main, re-enable SSK, and then go back into gamepad and turn this on, and then if you do that, let me just show you what you get. Okay, let's restart the game, and I'll move the joystick around a little bit. So here you go. So you get this table here. It's a little bit hard to read because it's small, but this is the event. Axis, device, name, normalized value, raw value. And then you could dig in more. You could say, okay, we dumped the event. Let me dump the axis portion. So dump event.axis. Save that. Load it. Joystick around. All right, good. Pause it. Now we're looking at the axis event, the axis table within the event, and we have things like accuracy, descriptor, max min value, number, and type. And so these are all things that we have to look at when we are trying to extract what joystick is it, what is the value that it has, etc., etc. So for this example, let me undo this before I commit it, because we're going to commit this with no SSK requirements. I care about the axis table, and the reason I care about that is because it's going to tell me which joystick it is. It's going to tell me, is it gamepad 1, which is the controller I care about. It's going to tell me the axis number, 1, 2, 3, or 4, because the axis events for the gamepad, the two joysticks, are 1, 2, 3, and 4, where 1 is the left joystick X, 2 is the left joystick Y, 3, it's in the code here, is right joystick X, and 4 is right joystick Y. Then 5 or 6 are the trigger buttons that I showed you just a moment ago, but we're not using those in our game, so other than detailing it in the code here, we don't care. So, okay, so we're looking at the axis event, and it gives us this descriptor string where I can pull out a part of it by splitting, by breaking down the string, and I can figure out what axis this is. Or I could look directly at number. Number also will tell me the axis number for this particular axis event. Another thing I care about is the axis descriptor. And let me just remember why I care about this. Let's take a look at it. Let me dump that out. Gamepad, give me one moment. Okay. Axis descriptor is descriptor field, and the descriptor field is non-present. Did I mess up? Oh, I did mess up. Okay, I'm sorry. That was the field I was just pointing at. What I like to do is break down the descriptor field instead of looking at the number field, and the reason is the descriptor field tells you, is it a gamepad? That's the first portion of the string. Then there's a number, and it tells you which gamepad it is. So for this one, I have one gamepad attached. Let's do this again. I know this sounds a little bit confusing. I'm going to go ahead and attach a second joystick.